So, let me get this straight. One of the best directors in film history was hired by one of the biggest game companies in history to not only make a commercial for one of the biggest game releases in video game history, but also to create the film adaptation of one of the biggest franchises in all of gaming and in all of horror history. And yet, it did not come to fruition. And instead, we got Paul W.S. Anderson's Rancid Turds. What kind of sense does that make? Well, apparently that's the story, as we are told in this brand new horror documentary. Now, yes, I know that today's review was supposed to be Den of Thieves 2 Pantera, I know, but due to unforeseen circumstances, I can't watch it today. So, because of that, I decided instead to take a look at this interesting little documentary I found while scouring through the internet. And it's a pretty interesting one. It's a pretty fascinating story that I never heard of, despite being a big fan of this particular person. So, I've decided to review this today and review Den of Thieves whenever I can. So, let me give you guys a little bit of backstory. Yeah, this is going to be a bit of a longer review because I have a lot to say. So, let's start with this. I am a huge fan of George Romero. I have been a huge fan of zombie films pretty much ever since I discovered horror. And this right here is my favorite horror movie of all time and one of my favorite movies of all time. It's so inspirational, it's so classic, it's so influential on not just the zombie genre, not just horror, but film in general. It's one of the landmark indie movies, and to this day, it has only gotten better. And yeah, this is a giant poster. I got this signed by Joe Russo, the producer of this movie. So, that was pretty cool. I met him a couple conventions ago, and I got this, and he signed it, and now it hangs. Well, it usually goes up there with my posters, but I want to wait until I get a frame to really put this up on display. But my point is, I am a huge fan of George Romero and his work, and that the original Night of the Living Dead is still my favorite horror movie of all time. So, knowing this man and his filmography, it surprised me that this one little project of his that I've never even heard of. Apparently, George Romero was hired by Capcom in this Constantine Film Company to create a film adaptation of Resident Evil. That just blows my mind that this didn't come to fruition or get fully released. It blows my mind. But here we are, we have a documentary about it, and it's a really good documentary. It's a fascinating watch because it's more history about Romero. It tells a bit about his life and his brief filmography and talking about his projects and how he was as a person. And also explains some of the early history of Resident Evil itself, like how the first game came around, how it was supposed to be a remake of Sweet Home for the Famicom, but instead became something different due to licensing reasons, and became the Resident Evil that we know now. So, knowing all of this background information, it surprised me to learn that George Romero was actually involved with Resident Evil. Now, keep in mind, another reason I probably didn't know this is because I'm not a huge Resident Evil fan. I've never been the biggest fan of them. I've been more of a Castlevania person myself. But I still love these movies, and I still love George Romero. So hearing that he was attached to the project was really cool. Not to mention, apparently, he was the one that created the live-action advertisement for Resident Evil 2 that unfortunately was only released in Japan for whatever weird, stupid reason. And this is all about the film project that was supposed to follow afterwards and how it all fell apart. And unfortunately, it's not really George's fault. It's more just the company being idiots. But let's talk about it step by step. I'll try not to spoil the whole thing, but there is a lot to discuss here. What's up? What's happening? What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Animation Station. Your number is Animation, including TV and movies as well. I'm your host, Jackson Small, a massive George A. Romero fan. And welcome to my review of George A. Romero's Resident Evil, a documentary about the movie that never was. Here's my written review. I hope you enjoy. Well, unfortunately, Den of Thieves 2 isn't happening today due to unforeseen circumstances, so instead I've decided to take a look at this very fascinating new documentary about one of my favorite directors and the film adaptation of Resident Evil that was being filmed before the one that we got was actually released. 5 years after its initial announcement, by the way. Featuring interviews from the likes of James Rolfe, yes, the angry video game nerd, Christian Stavrakis, the son of Tastos Stavrakis, one of the makeup people that worked under Tom Savini on Friday the 13th, Ben Rubin, George Demick, and even one of the creators of Resident Evil, Kenichi Iwao. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. This documentary cuts deep into the background of both the late great George A. Romero and the early beginnings of the Resident Evil franchise to uncover the secrets of why and how Romero's version of this film adaptation of the series never made it to the big screen. And it's a pretty fascinating watch. There's great use of live-action recreations of a few scenes from the games for transitions. Some of the interviews are being formatted to look like they're playing on old CTVs, which added to the atmosphere. And having never known prior knowledge of Romero ever being involved with this franchise, it was really interesting to hear about how it all unfolded. Not to mention the fact that apparently he made the commercial for Resident Evil 2 with Screaming Mad George, a horror movie legend. And honestly, after watching it, I kind of wish that George got to make his version rather than us being subjected to the cinematic abominations we ended up with. I freaking hate the Paul W.S. Anderson Resident Evil movies. They are some of the most crappy, inaccurate, stupid, dull, boring, and just seizure-inducing friggin' video game adaptations that I've ever been subjected to. I mean, the first two were fine, but after that, the rest of them are rancid turds. And after watching this documentary, and especially hearing a podcaster who is a huge fan of Resident Evil read out the basic outline of the script and the plot, it sounded amazing, dude. Like, there were constant references and Easter eggs to the games, there was insane amounts of blood and gore, like, it sounded so cool, but because of studio nonsense, we're never gonna get to see it. And it pisses me off, man. It pisses me off. In summary, Constantine films are greedy asinine douchebags who cared more about money rather than being faithful to the actual source material. To the point of saying that the source material wasn't even that bloody and the studio head does not like violence. Yeah, executive meddling is just the best, isn't it? That being said, though, it's not super rewatchable. Don't get me wrong, I love Romero's work, and learning more about his work was really cool. But since I'm not a big fan of Resident Evil personally, being more of a Castlevania type of guy, it's definitely a one and done. And almost 2 hours is way too long for this story. Like, there is so much padding about the backstory of Romero, and then the backstory of Resident Evil, and then the backstory of Resident Evil's success leading into Resident Evil 2, before it actually gets to the main story here about how Romero wrote this script for Resident Evil, was going to film this big movie adaptation of Resident Evil, and then was pretty much fired by corporate execs for creative differences, as Romero called it. And it takes to 45 minutes to get to that mark. Like, you could have easily shaved it down a little bit, guys. However, it's still worth at least one watch, especially for horror fans, longtime fans of Romero like myself, and of course, especially if you are a fan of Resident Evil and you want to learn more about its history. So, it's a pretty good documentary. Not to mention, the final half hour is a very loving, touching tribute to George Romero. It almost made me cry. It was a really emotional, touching tribute to him. Not to mention also learning about his foundation and how it's still trying to find ways to support independent filmmaking. That's something special, man. That goes beyond film. So, yeah, I've discussed the pros, I've discussed the cons, and I've discussed pretty much at length that I'm a huge fan of this guy, and learning more about this was very interesting. So, my final verdict for this documentary, though, because I'm not a big fan of Resident Evil, I have to knock it back a bit. It's going to be a 7.5 out of 10 for the final verdict. It's a really, really good documentary, and it tells a very fascinating story, but it takes 40 minutes to get to that story, and it has a lot of padding. Not to mention, if you're not a fan of Resident Evil, even if you are a big fan of George Romero, it's not going to be the most interesting thing in the world to you. So, yeah, it's a pretty interesting, fascinating watch, and it's definitely worth seeing if you are a fan of Romero, of Resident Evil, or just horror and filmmaking in general. So, yeah, definitely check it out when you get a chance. I definitely think that it is worth your time. Alright, well, that's all I can really say. Like I said, I don't want to spoil everything that happened, because then you won't have a purpose of watching the documentary. So, thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more horrifying videos like this almost every single day. And if you excuse me, I'm going to go rewatch this again now. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next review. Take care.
Listen out to forget, so listen and you won't regret. Be true to yourself, don't miss your chance, and you won't end up like the fool who ripped his pants.